Hey everybody, hope you guys are doing well. I know this takes a few seconds to load up, but as you log in, let me know if you're able to hear me and see me so I could know that everything is functioning properly here. So again, hi everybody, hope you guys are doing well. Here we are again in another session talking about mental health. Today we're going to be speaking about living with grief and loss, and I know I have to give everyone a couple of minutes to get on. So I'll give you guys just a couple of minutes to start logging in. I see a few people logged in already. Let me know if you're able to hear and see me so that I can know that everything is functioning well. On my end, it looks okay, but I just need to be sure from the other side how it's functioning. So let me know, and just greet me so I could know that you are here. Hey, Melody, good to see you there. Hope you guys are all well. Doma, how are you? Good to see you. Hey, Eddie, God bless you. Good evening. All right, cool. So we got a few people on. I'll give a couple of more minutes. Hey, Judy, good to have you on. Hope everybody's doing well. Okay, thank you, Melody. You let me know that everything is functioning. Fantastic. And I know from your end, sometimes it may skip a little bit or it may flutter or whatever it is. Once it's uploaded, that doesn't happen. So that'll work. That'll work. You'll see it on YouTube and later on when it's reshared. Hey, Eliana, good to see you there. So we've had several conversations now. I think this might be the fifth one. We began with an introduction to mental health. We've spoken about ambivalence. We spoke about those emotional vampires, part one and part two. That was quite extensive there. And today we're going to be speaking about living with grief and loss. So again, I'll give a couple of minutes for people to get on. Hey, Myrna, good to see you there. Jay, God bless you. Hope you're doing well. Thank you for sharing that again. And what really we're going to focus on is talking about how grief and loss affects us, of course, but also how can we deal with this, so that we're able to effectively help ourselves and help other individuals. And of course, to the best of our ability. In 1 hour, we're not going to cover all the information that there is regarding grief and loss. This is so extensive that we could spend many months, many weeks, and many months discussing this, because there is no one way that people grieve. There's just no one way. People grieve in all different ways. So people are still coming on. So I'll give you guys a moment to get on. Hey, Anna, good to see you there. Jenny, Carmen and Henry, Susanna, Veronica. God bless you all. So I hope you guys are doing well, and I'm hoping that these forums are instructive to everybody here. I would love to get feedback from you guys. Not just it was good. That's not enough feedback. The feedback has to be how it was instructive, and what can be done so that it could be even better in the future, or what other topics you would like to have covered. It was mentioned. Several people mentioned that they would like to speak about grief and loss, suffering. And so today's class is going to be, or today's forum is really going to be focusing on that, how we can deal with grief and loss, but also how we can help other individuals that are dealing with grief and loss. So we're just going to get into this here. On the chat, I posted, and Jay reposted there, a couple of names of some different individuals, 4 different individuals that I've had to take lessons from, be it through videotapes or through sessions. And there are a couple of things that they mentioned. So Ron Hawkins talks about a theology of suffering. Eric Scalise speaks about complex trauma. Kevin Ellers speaks about effective interventions, and Diane Langberg, she's really focusing on she focuses on trauma and abuse, but specifically from a theological standpoint, we're going to mention at the very end how we can learn from Jesus in dealing with all the situations that can come upon us. So, just to begin, all of us here have suffered grief and loss to some extent. Now, I want you guys to remember, I don't want you to post any personal stuff here. This is not about that. No personal things come here. This is all very general, all very, very general. And of course, you can post as you please, but it cannot be things that might make somebody else uncomfortable, because all of us are dealing with different things, but we don't need to be explicit about what we are going through because someone else might be affected by that. So just keep that in mind as you post different things here. And this is not about any one person in general. So please don't ask specific questions about your situation. That's a private conversation. Here, this is all general stuff. Okay? So thank you, and just keep that in mind as whatever you post. And when you post, take your time in writing, because the computers autocorrect and they write some ridiculous things that you did not intend to write. But I see it from my end, and then I have to delete it. So just keep that in mind. But yes, a couple of people are talking about the grief that they have suffered, needing therapy to deal with grief. I was mentioning to my daughter earlier on today that my sister passed away 26 years ago, and I still grieve the loss of my sister because I miss her. We were very close, and so it's still today. It's difficult for me because I would love to have contact with her, but that's not a possibility right now. So I'm still living with grief and loss, but this is the point. I'm still living, and this is where we need to come to. How do we live with grief and loss? So of course, we are speaking in generalities, but let's break it down a little bit. So Ron Hawkins, who I mentioned earlier, speaks about a theology of suffering. What is a theology of suffering? Well, you have to understand, one of the titles of Jesus was Man of Sorrows. What a title. In other words, he was acquainted. Isaiah 53 says that he was acquainted with grief, with suffering, with trauma. This was a part of his being. And so we need to understand that it's not as if the scriptures are far removed from what you and I suffer. They are together with what you and I are suffering. But even going beyond that, to get into this here, Ron Hawkins speaks to us about this theology of suffering and reasons for suffering that are mentioned in the scriptures and that are part of our life right now. So I'm just going to put out the reasons, or some of the reasons that he suggests cause suffering is caused in our lives, why it happens in our life. Now, of course, these are generalities. You might be able to share some after this section is done. So, for example, he says, reasons for suffering. Suffering can be a consequence of poor decisions. We don't want to hear that, right? Nobody wants to hear that. This is reality of life. Sometimes you and I have made some poor decisions, and then as a consequence of that poor decision, we have suffered some kind of loss, and we also grieve. That's a possibility. That is not to say that everybody that is grieving, it is because of a poor decision, but I think you all understand that now. Now, grief and a loss can also come because of our own pride. For example, in the Bible it says that Paul was given a thorn in the flesh. Why? Because he may have had a tendency to become prideful because of the incredible revelations that God had given him. So what did God want to do? Did God want to hurt him? Absolutely not. God wanted him to measure himself in a manner that he would be able to help other people. Prideful individuals very likely are not going to be very helpful to anybody else. So God had to let him know, hey, come down here, Paul, where the humans live, so that he could be of help to other people. And later on, I'm going to quote him. He was and continues to be an excellent help to us as believers. Sometimes grief and loss come as a discipline for things that we have done wrong. A biblical example is David and Bathsheba. The Bible is clear. They had a child from their getting together, and that child died as a result of their sin. Now, you might say that's unfair of God, and that's okay. You certainly can believe that. There's nothing wrong with that. It may seem that it was unfair of God, but it was the consequence of their sin that caused the death of that child, and God is explicit about that. The scripture is explicit about that. So that's another thing. Sometimes we don't know why we're suffering. We just don't know. There's not a specific thing that you and I can pinpoint why we're suffering. Now, I'll give you an example. I have some students in the school where I work. As you know, I work with autistic students, and some who are intellectually disabled, and some of them have a perpetual look of sadness, a perpetual look of bewilderment, of not understanding why they're here. And some of them is very difficult even to get into their psyche, to speak to them and to try to understand them. There is a constant sadness in some of them, just like there is a constant sadness in some of us. And we may not even be aware of why that occurs. Well, that simply is because we exist on this sin sick and tired world. And sometimes it drains us and we get tired and we may get even physically ill and we don't even understand the why of it. Simply that we are here, and sometimes whatever it is seems to come crushing down upon us and we don't understand what's going on. So sometimes we don't know why we're suffering. Job is an incredible example in scripture of him not knowing why he was going through what he was going through, while behind the scenes, God opens up the heavens to let us understand that there was a cosmic confrontation, and he was the warrior that God had chosen. And he was successful, even though from his standpoint, it didn't look that way. And then there could also be satanic warfare. There are things going on in the environment around us that we're not even aware of. But maybe you have at some point in your life come in contact with somebody, and when you met this individual, or when you were in the same room as this individual or in close proximity, somehow, some way, that person's affect brought you down. There was something going on inside of that individual, or even individuals that you know now, family members or friends or other people that sometimes you get in contact with, and there seems to be something off there. There's something wrong. There's a spiritual situation going on there that you cannot pinpoint. You and I are affected by those things also. And as Jenny says, anxiety and stress can make us ill. Not only can they make us ill, they can kill us. And so we need to be very careful. But then again, another reason for suffering is God loosens our grip on this world. Sometimes we get too satisfied on this planet. This is not everything. That we, those who are Bible believing Christians here, we understand that we're here for a time. It's not forever. It is for a time. And a time comes when we begin to lose our grip on this place because we're getting prepared to go to our eternal resting place. Now, for Bible believing Christians and those who are seeking to do live a righteous life and do righteous deeds, we understand that that's going to be a place of peace and rest. But nevertheless, it can still cause anxiety, and it can still cause stress, and it can still sadden us because we leave other people behind, and we get concerned for those individuals that we leave behind. That's a reality. But also, reasons for suffering, reasons for grief and loss, God can also bring glory to himself through our suffering. That doesn't sound good, but think about the blind man and Jesus. One example, Jesus himself said, this happened for the glory of God. In other words, God was giving these people an eternal perspective. You have the grief and loss of Joseph and his brothers. His brothers thought that they were all okay until confronted by Joseph, and they thought he was going to get revenge on them. But what were his words? Genesis 15:20. 50:20. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. So we need to understand that sometimes there are things going on behind the scenes that we do not understand, that we don't have a handle on. We don't have a handle on that. But the reality is, God does have a handle on that. And maybe in this life, we will never understand some of the things that grieved us and hurt us so much. But at the same time, they were a cause for rejoicing and strength in another individual's life. Think about that. I think of someone like Joni Erickson Tada, a woman who's much older now, but at the age of 17, she went diving. She had all her faculties. She could do everything. She went diving, hit a rock, and became paralyzed from her neck down for the rest of her life, even now. Yet, she has testified to millions of individuals from her bed. That's incredible. That's really, really incredible. It's hard for me to fathom that. But yet, through her grief and loss, millions have been blessed. So we have to understand that also. Oh, Michelle tells us something good here. She asks the question, can a reason for suffering be testing our faith? Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes the Lord will put us in a situation where, yeah, there is grieving and there is loss. There's suffering, but at the same time, the Lord is strengthening us. And we're going to come to that a little bit more, actually, right now. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4. The same Apostle Paul, who we spoke about earlier, you know what he says? Sometimes we suffer to help others. That's a paraphrase. It's a comfort chain. In other words, I'm suffering, and the suffering that I'm going through is going to be a life lesson for somebody else. Somehow, some way, if I suffer in a way that honors God, I am going to help somebody else in the midst of their suffering. So we have to understand some of the things that we go through sometimes are a life lesson for somebody else, even though you're not feeling very well about what's going on. Our suffering may be for the sake of others. So, for example, a divorce, death of a child, an illness. Other people whom we love also are suffering, and we suffer because they are suffering. So it's not always something that we have done. There are intentions of other individuals that cause us suffering. And then Paul, again, tells us something very interesting in the book of Colossians, chapter 1, verse 24. Colossians 1:24. Sometimes he was talking about himself, but we also fill up that which is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. What does that mean? You and I, in our suffering, somehow, some way, are completing God's plan on this earth. Can I explain that? No, I can't fully explain that. But we need to understand that in our negative situations, the way we carry that, we help someone or we hinder someone. So we need to keep that in mind. And then, finally, in this section here, in the theology of suffering, we are told that we don't have to answer people in suffering. We don't have to answer them. We need to communicate the presence of God. We need to provide acceptance, affirmation, and encouragement. That's what we are called to do. Too many of us are looking for reasons. Don't always look for a reason. You know why? Because sometimes we're just going to fall short. And in doing that, we further add to the suffering of the individual. Sometimes we just need to mourn with those who are mourning. Shortest verse in the Bible, you know it well. Jesus wept. That's it. Jesus wept. So let's not go beyond the knowledge that we have and let God redeem people in the midst of their suffering. So now I want to hear from you. Any other ideas or things that you might consider as for why we may suffer or why we live with grief and loss? So share as you please. What other reasons might there be for grief and suffering besides those that I already mentioned? And of course, we could spend the whole hour just on this section, but I want to hear what you guys have to say regarding that. And all of that was a theology of suffering from Ron Hawkins. Yes, Veronica, Ronnie, she says it well. We miss the person. As I said earlier, I miss my sister. We miss the person. Oh, Eileen gives us a really good thing here. Growth. Oh, yeah. Growth is very important. There is something called post-traumatic growth. Now, we don't often speak of that, but we talk about it a lot. We'll generally say, "Oh, what doesn't kill you make you stronger." We may not like the quote, but there's some truth to that. Do you know that as you lift weights or do various exercises, your body grows through the trauma that you are imposing upon it? But I believe the growth that Eileen is talking about is maturity. Yeah, the years of hurt on this earth will mature us if if we take things well. Eddie, what do you mean by self-destruction? You got to break that down a little bit there, because I want to make sure that I'm not imposing upon you something that you don't mean. Yeah, the Apostle Paul suffered. He breaks it down for us. He suffered in an incredible way. Well, yeah, immigration, going from one place to another place, especially if you are forced to go from one place to another place, you can suffer the consequences of not knowing a language, not knowing the people, of losing status. I know people who were doctors in their country and they come here and they're no longer doctors because it's not the same language. They can't pass some of the exams that we have to take here. And so it changes them. Oh, Jay says something really good. We just do not want to let go because it means an end of a lifestyle and tradition. Yes, that is very possible. That actually occurs quite often, especially well, when there is a loss of income, for example. That could happen based on retirement. That could happen based on a sickness that you can no longer work. So these things occur. Yeah, Anna says that you can bring suffering upon yourself by your actions. Absolutely, the consequences of our actions. Yes, thank you, Eddie, for clarifying. Sometimes we mentally hurt ourselves by overthinking. Absolutely. If you're very analytical, you got to be careful with that because sometimes you are going beyond reality and you're taking yourself to a negative place. So sometimes we have to quiet our thoughts. That's very important. But what I will do is I'll put music or I'll go work out or I will do something to stop that thinking. I will pray. I will read the scriptures. I will do something to interrupt the negative conversation in my head. You have to learn to do that. Well, we're going to come to some ways of doing that in a second. Jenny says, even a good person will suffer greater than what they deserve. Well, what do we deserve? I don't know. What do we deserve? If you come from a theological perspective, the Bible is clear that Jesus took death for us. So do we really suffer beyond what we deserve? I would say yes in terms of a child, maybe. But we have to contextualize everything. Do we deserve to suffer? Do we deserve not to suffer? Which one is correct? In this world, we are guaranteed suffering. Guaranteed. But you and I need to determine how we are going to suffer, how we are going to deal with loss, how we're going to deal with disease, how we're going to deal with sickness, how we're going to deal with whatever are those things that seek to bring us down. Oh, Reza tells us that we have to learn to relax ourselves, or that if we don't relax ourselves, well, we are going to suffer. This is very true. Earlier, someone mentioned stress and anxiety. Well, stress and anxiety will raise our blood pressure, can cause a cardiac arrest, give us a heart attack, and so many other things. And that's very dangerous. So we have to learn how to do those things. Anna says, she said, she put it in Spanish, sometimes yo, eres telco y no aceptas las cosas como son. So she says, sometimes we're big heads or we're dummies and we don't accept things the way they are. Yeah, this is true. Sometimes, as we said before, we go overboard in analyzing what is going on. So, you know what? Somebody, let's say, for example, they go through a stoplight and their car hits your car. It could have been anybody's car that got hit. It happened that you were going through the light at that time and it happened to you. I was coming out of a parking lot and I scratched the whole side of my car. Does that make me any better or any worse than anybody else? No, it's an accident, and accidents do happen. So we need to be careful about reading too much into things that occur in our lives, because then we will begin to think, oh, God is punishing me. We got to be very careful. Again, we call this magical thinking, where we make things up and we make them a reality in our lives when it's not reality. So we have to be careful with that. Jay says that self-maintenance is very important. Okay, let me see. Susanna says we don't deserve anything. Oh, the Bible is clear that Jesus took a hit that belonged to us. But then I sometimes say, well, I didn't ask to be born, Lord. And God is like, just read the Bible. And I get it. I get it. They're all factors work together. The Bible is clear in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, for our good. Everything works together for our good. That doesn't mean I understand why God allows these things all the time. Okay? I forgot the name you told me last week, but Mother Wildflower Seed says, she said, recently I've read that traumatic stress from childhood leads a person to grow to be an overthinker. Well, that's a possibility, but that's also a generalization. That may not happen to every person. Enid, thank you, Enid. Oh, Henry says, I think these last 2 years have made me more acquainted with suffering. I guess you're referring to the pandemic. I think that's what you're referring to. But this is the reality. There's always suffering. Maybe it just hasn't affected you so much or me so much. Now we're all in there. And Paul asked the question, is the fall of man a consequence of suffering? The fall of man is a consequence of making a decision. And then that decision that leads to suffering, including our suffering. But we're going to move on to another section here, because the conversation is good and we could stay here all night. Second part here, we're going to talk about complex trauma or complex grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, incredible woman, a psychiatrist, spoke about stages of grief. But if you go to her website, well, she passed away, but the website that was done in her name, I believe her son did it. She amends what she says. She's not saying that you go from one section from one stage of suffering to another stage, to another stage, to another stage, to another stage. What she's saying is that all of these stages of suffering are included in our lives. All of them are included in our lives. So you may be at one stage and transition to another stage and return to a previous stage. We can't say that everybody suffers the same way. We have to be careful about that. Very, very careful. Because you can't tell me how to suffer, and I can't tell you how to suffer. But you could join me in my suffering, and I can join you in your suffering. But you can't tell me how to do it. You can help me get through it, or you can help me live with it. And this is what we need to be very careful. Sasha says, sometimes we grieve our dreams when life takes unexpected turns and we cannot execute our plans. Yes, grief can accompany any great life change. This is very true. I'm getting closer to finishing at my job, getting closer to retirement, and I already noticed that I'm grieving leaving some of the students that I work with, because I really enjoy working with them. So I already know this is a good thing. I'll have more time to do things that I want to do. Fantastic. But at the same time, there is associated with that parting some grief. So it's a great life change. So that occurs. So let's go to Eric Scalise, that was I mentioned earlier. Jay, thank you. He posted again. And this is talking about complex trauma and grief. What does that mean? All that means is that it may be better. I don't mean better, greater than what we usually term trauma or grief. When your trauma and your grief stop you from doing the normal things that is expected of a person, then you may be in what's called complicated grief or complex trauma. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of what that means, what that's talking about. It generally refers to multiple traumatic or grief stressors that involve direct harm, and sometimes they can be interpersonal. Now that means that sometimes our grief and our loss is because we were hurt by somebody and it was premeditated, planned, and caused by other individuals. A mugging, a shooting, someone just for whatever reason. You see, if you see the news, you see what's happening in the subways every day. That for no reason, people are deciding to hurt other individuals, except that they want their things, or they just want to hurt somebody. Well, this is how complex trauma or complex grief is caused, because there really is no reason that you can fathom as to why another person would want to hurt you. So that's part of that. Now, these things, such as violating and exploiting another person, human trafficking, that kind of thing, it's something that is very difficult to come out of, even many years after the suffering has stopped. And maybe next week or the week after, we'll talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and how difficult it is to come out of that, but not impossible. We're going to cover that. But what's happening here with complex trauma and complex grief, that these can be chronic and long-term. They can affect the way a person lives for the rest of their lives. So what can cause these things? Some examples are poverty, excessive community violence, homelessness, incarceration, residential treatment centers, sexual abuse, human rights violations. Uba spoke about immigration. I'll change it to displacement, when you are forced to leave your homeland, exposure to death, accidents, and natural disasters. When a child is subjected to some of these things, the chemistry of their brain is altered. It literally is changed, and their brain may not even develop to the extent that a normal brain without the trauma develops. And so there are real reasons as to why they are unable to function like everybody else is able to function. And so we need to understand these things when we are working with different individuals, that there is often, when it comes to complex trauma and grief, underlying situations that have led them to that particular place. And some other effects mentioned to us by Dr. Scalise there are alterations, changes in the regulation of affective impulses. What does that mean? In the way they conduct themselves emotionally, something is changed there, something is altered. There may be a lack of self-regulation, a lack of self-control because of what they have suffered. And this is where you and I need to be careful. As you counsel an individual with this situation, you must respect their boundaries and you must set limits. Because if not, you will be drawn into a place where you may not want to be. So again, we have to be very careful here. There may be alterations in attention and in consciousness. In other words, the person can just, we call it derealization, but you might call it they space out. For no reason, they're talking to you, they're having a conversation, next thing you know, you don't know where they're at, even though they're standing right beside you. That can occur. There are alterations in self-perception, the way the person perceives themselves, who they are and why they exist now changes based on the suffering that they have gone through or the grief and loss that they have experienced. There may be alterations in their perception of the perpetrator, of the person who has hurt them or abandoned them, or the person that they have lost, because they don't fully understand what happened there. Now, what this might look like, hatred, or it might look like they actually seek out the person who hurt them and seek to re-enter into that relationship, which is a dangerous proposition, but it is something that occurs. Then, alterations in relationships with other people around them, something called somatization. What are these? Physical complaints and or medical problems. A person experiencing migraines, experiencing sensations in their body, stomach aches, skin rashes, loss of hair. All of those things can occur because the person is internalizing the grief and the loss and the trauma, and now it is coming out, literally, it is coming out in their pores, it is coming out in their body. And so we need to be able to regulate those things also. Not always easy, but we have to find mechanisms to do that. And then there may be alterations in systems of meaning. The person may be seeking answers, and answers are not forthcoming. I know that's a lot. How do you think, and we're going to come to this section now, a person can help a person who is suffering to live with the suffering? Oh, okay, well, Nancy already posted one there. Thank you. Having strong support systems and staying around people that can pray and pour into our lives. Absolutely. Never isolate too long. We need to have more conversations about suffering. Access to resources and services are key. The current systems are lacking equity. Oh, absolutely. Not everybody has the same access to these resources, but that's something that we can help change. So that's something we should be seeking to do. But again, the question is out there. How do you think you may be able to enter into another person's suffering and help them? And then we're going to discuss some of those things that we can do. I know your fingers are busy typing away back there. How can we effectively help someone else who's suffering, who's living with grief and loss, suffering from some kind of trauma? How do we enter there? Okay, Henry says something good. Yeah, we should listen more. We need to listen a lot more. One of the things that I have noticed in my years of counseling is that the most effective counselor is not the one who's doing a lot of talking. That's not what we're doing. If you are talking more, unless you're teaching, that's different. If you are talking more than the person that you're counseling, you may be overwhelming them, and they will not continue to speak because you're not giving them an outlet. We have to be careful about that. Remember, the question is, how can we help other people in their suffering, in living with grief and loss? Okay, Eileen gives us another one. Being present. What being present mean? That you are simply there, that you're close by. You don't always have to talk. You know, one of the things that I've learned, and many of you already know this, is the ministry of presence. Just being there. You don't have to do a lot of talking. You can just sit beside a person and just be there. This is very important. Oh, yeah. Enid says something very good. Listening and hearing are two different things. Oh, yes, they are. Oh, yes, they are. That's really important. Nancy says, by loving them unconditionally, listen, praying, encouraging, helping them identify resources. Absolutely. Ronnie says, by being supportive and encouraging. Okay. Jay says something very good, and this goes back to what the Apostle Paul tells us. Sometimes we have suffered to help other individuals. He says some of us can share our experiences on how we have overcome suffering. Share your success and strategy over such situations. And I would even say sometimes share your failures, because people need to know that it is okay to fail at times, and you can recover from that also. Hear what their needs are, offer what's needed, if you can, of course. Dima says, being honest, have a good ear, and don't judge. Give them your testimony. Oh, yeah, Vilma says something very good. Don't downplay their grief. That's very important. Reza says, the person has to know that you are there for them. Absolutely. It's so important that people recognize that you are present to them. Sasha says, Simply being present, even if it's just silently, is so vital. Job's friends sat in silence with him, and to me, that's always so powerful because it demonstrates the power of community and connection. Absolutely. Job's friends, I believe it was for those first 7 days, they sat with him. We call it sitting Shiva. They sat with him, they didn't speak. When they started speaking, they messed it up, but they didn't speak, and they showed connection. They showed community. They showed they suffered with him. That's important. Sometimes we're going to be called to suffer with the individual. Yeah, Henry says when sharing your experiences, timing is important. That's very true. Well, if someone's family member has passed away, that might not be a good time to start talking about your family member that passed away. You have to be able to, for lack of a better term, read the room, know when you should share some things. Okay, Nancy says finding something to celebrate about them and building up their self-esteem. That's important. Now, in keeping with that, you have to measure if they are in a celebratory mood, because you don't want to celebrate before it's time to celebrate. And Ronnie tells us being empathetic. That's very good. And that's better than being sympathetic. Sympathetic is I feel sorry for you. Empathetic is I'm going to be here with you. Okay, excellent. Thank you for all of those. We're going to go on to the third section here. Kevin Ellers talks to us about effective interventions. And thank you, because you mentioned quite a few of them. Some of the things that we should or should not do. When you're working with somebody that is suffering, living with grief and loss, do not panic or overreact. The worst thing you can do is cry more than that person who's crying, and now they need to stop crying to take care of you. Don't do that. You might not be the person that can help that person. You have to be very careful there. You have to be very careful. Well, Carmen Henry says, don't ponder on them that their loved one is not or is in heaven. Yeah, we got to be careful about those things, right? We cannot put someone in heaven and we cannot take someone out of hell. We don't have to go there at all. We are there to deal with the person who is suffering. We just have to be present with them there at that moment. Reza says, I love to let people know that I'm there, talk and listen at any time. And that's important, that we truly are available according to the needs of the individual. So again, do not panic or overreact. Don't do that, because now you're taking the momentum away from that person who is suffering. Don't make it your show. It is about that individual who is suffering. Remain calm. A calming influence makes a big difference in a person's life, especially when they are going through a hard time. Remain with them, if at all possible. Remain with them sometime. It has to be for some time. It doesn't have to be all the time. Be present. All of you have already said that. And respect their feelings and thoughts. That's important. Let them say whatever they're going to say. If some correction has to be done, maybe it could be done a little later. But at the moment, respect. They may be angry. They may be hollering. They may be yelling. They may be screaming. You know what? Let them vent their grief for a time and be there and be present with them. Help them if it is necessary. Help them to reframe their thoughts. What does that mean? Maybe you have the possibility of helping them to think about things in a different way. Now, that, of course, depends on the situation in which the person is suffering. You have to be able to emphasize the fact that they are suffering at the moment and that it is okay. It is okay for them to suffer. In other words, you need to normalize the suffering. Don't act as if what they're doing is from another planet, from another world. All of us suffer. All of us go through negative situations. So allow them to normalize that situation there, what they are going through. Keep yourself safe. What does that mean? Don't get drawn into situations in which you're going to get in trouble now because you got too close. So be close, but be respectfully close. Sometimes, and this was mentioned before, I think it was Nancy, you have to explore resources. You know why? Because there's going to come a time when you're not going to be available. You're not going to be able to be there all the time. You got to go to work or you got to do other things. So explore alternatives and resources to the individual. Help them by giving them other things that they can do. Of course, you have to allow them that season of suffering, that season of crying. And remember, don't tell a person you're going to get over it. Don't tell them that. You don't know that. They may live with that for the rest of their lives. A person who has lost a child, parents don't normally bury their children. So when that occurs, you have to be very careful about how you speak about that situation. Just let them know, I'm here. Whatever you want to say, I'm not going to judge you because you're saying it at this time. Allow them to vent their grief. Allow them to vent their grief. And then, because most of you already shared on some effective interventions, I'm going to give you an intervention that when I read this, I thought was excellent. Diane Langberg, PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, talks about trauma and abuse. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to be studying one of her books. This book, it doesn't pertain to this class, but it might be helpful for you guys at some point if you want to read this. Counseling Survivors of Sexual Abuse. This is going to be the next class that I take. This is Counseling Survivors of Sexual Abuse. Diane Langberg, PhD. You can find it. It's available on Amazon and other places. And she writes what I'm going to talk about now. Now, this is really important. This is really, really important, and we have to be careful about here. Simply speaking words, no matter how true, is not sufficient when responding to people who have been abused or are grieving or are in loss. Sometimes we can overspeak. We have to be careful about that. Don't say I'm available if you're not available. Don't do that. And it's okay not to be available. It might have to be that you say, I'm available today, but tomorrow this person is available. And the next day, this other person is available. Because you may not be available all the time. So you have to be careful about that. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Diane tells us to learn from Jesus. And she breaks it down for us. First of all, she says, you got to do like he did. You have to leave glory. What does that mean? You have to enter into the person's suffering. You may not be prepared to do that. So you got to keep that in mind. So number one, leave glory. Enter into the person's suffering. Number two, you got to become little. What does that mean? Reduce yourself in helping others. Allow yourself to be taught. They are the experts in their suffering. You could be the expert in knowing about these things, but they are the expert in what they are going through at the moment. You're being present with them. So again, do what Jesus did. Become little. Reduce yourself in helping others. That's very important. Number three, enter darkness. What does that mean? You don't know what's coming. You don't know what's coming as that person is suffering. You don't know what they're going to say. You don't know what they're going to think. You don't know what they're going to do. So enter darkness. You don't know what's coming. Attempt to think like the person who is now being victimized by the grief or the loss or the trauma. Attempt to think like them. You may not be able to. Number four, bear the character of the Father. In other words, bear the character of God, full of grace and truth. What does that mean? Light dawned because it was lived out in the flesh. You have to demonstrate God's character: truth, love, mercy, and grace. So that's a lot. That's a lot. So you need to be prepared. If you're going to enter into somebody's suffering, you're either in or you're not in. That's why it's not for everybody, and that's okay. It may not be for you. There's nothing wrong with that. Number 5, do not abandon those in need. Do not leave them alone. Suffer with the suffering. Crisis after crisis will tire you. You have to have staying power. You have to endure the suffering together with the person who is suffering. If you're not prepared to do that, then don't enter into their suffering. Because once you did, the expectation is that you're going to be there and available to them. That's not an easy thing. And number 6, do not lose perspective and allow thinking or your thinking to be distorted. Do not, in other words, do not be overcome by the darkness of the suffering of that individual. Another way of putting it is, don't get sick with the sick. Don't catch the diseases of those with whom you are working. What does that mean? Don't go so deep into their suffering that now you have been negatively affected by that suffering. Well, that's quite a bit. That's not always easy. If you're going to truly enter into another person's suffering, a person living with grief and loss, you need to be prepared to suffer along with them, but not suffer more than them. You have to be available, but at the same time, you have to be safe. And finally, you cannot call or instruct people out of suffering. You can't do that. Be a sanctuary for the person who is suffering. Be a sanctuary for the abused. Be a sanctuary for those who are suffering grief and loss. What does that mean? You and I can become a temple in which that person can allow their grief and their loss to slowly be not taken away, but some form of healing to begin in their lives. Is it going to totally be removed? I would say no. As I said in the beginning of this talk here, I grieved the death of my sister. That was 26 years ago. I'll never forget her. I grieved the death of my grandmother, whom I love so dearly, and other individuals. And all of us carry the scars of grief and loss. We carry that. But do we carry them well? How do we live our lives in terms of helping somebody living with grief and loss? Well, if you want to do that kind of work, then you know what? It's not a superficial work. It is an intensive work where you go into the person's suffering without allowing that suffering to now make you be as sick as the individual who is suffering. Yes, to help others, you have to keep yourself strong. That is very important. In other words, if you can't care for yourself, how can you care for somebody else? You know, in the scriptures, Jesus would tell his disciples, come away for some time. Come away for some time. Rest, sleep, eat. And Elijah in the Old Testament, after he had an incredible victory, he was feeling down. What does God do? God feeds him, gives him something to drink, lets him sleep. This is what we get wrong. You do not have to be available 24/7. As a matter of fact, it may not be good for you to be available 24/7, because if you're available to that extent to one person, you're not available to that extent to other people. So keep that in mind. Keep yourself strong. Keep yourself healthy. Keep yourself ready. And then you are going to be able to serve other individuals. And remember this, you are also going to be able to be prepared to be served when it is necessary. That's important. Nancy asked the question earlier, and I'm just going to touch it briefly. She says, sometimes we may need to recommend counseling and professional help. Could you elaborate when grieving can become clinical? Simply put, grieving becomes clinical when the person is unable to function normally anymore because of their grief and their loss. In other words, they cannot take care of themselves on a daily basis because of what has occurred to them. That's the bottom line. Then it has become clinical. Anything that stops you from being able to do the normal things that you were able to do before that situation, that is a clinical situation. So, I know that was a lot. And we're going to end in about 5 minutes here. Please, your thoughts, your additions. What do you think? Anything now? When we're living with grief and loss, remember, we're talking about living with grief and loss. In other words, it's not necessarily overcoming or getting over it or recovering or dealing with it. It's living, that you are able to go on with your life, but you're still carrying that burden. So that looks like different things to different individuals, and we all carry it differently, and we all need to learn how to carry it, because at some point, if it hasn't happened to you, you are going to have some grief and some loss. So we spoke about reasons for suffering, complex trauma, effective interventions, and learn from Jesus that he dared to leave glory to enter darkness. We don't think of it like that. When we enter into another person's suffering, we basically are entering the darkness with which they are dealing with. But you can be the light. So, any closing thoughts? We have 3 minutes. Please feel free. Oh, Michelle asked, you asked it earlier. Sorry, I missed it. She asked, can God use suffering to discipline us? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. So he wasn't being punished. He wasn't being punished. But God had him in training ground. Your suffering and my suffering is training ground. Even when we get off track, sometimes the Lord puts us back on track by allowing suffering in our lives. So sometimes our disobedience at the end turns out to be instructive for us if we're not careful and don't go too far. Right? You got to be careful about that also. Uba says forgiveness is also very important, and it depends on what you mean by that. You're very welcome, Zordi. Just thank you for this teaching. She loved it. Forgiveness is important, but again, we contextualize what forgiveness looks like. When a person is going through suffering at that moment, we may not be talking about forgiveness at that moment. That conversation may come much later on. Jay says, God gave us life, and we should not stay stagnant in the grief and suffering that is in and around us. Amen. That's good. We should not stay stagnant, but we sometimes need help to not stay stagnant. Eddie says, thank you. Is a lot to ponder on. Okay. Enid tells us that she's been able to deal with grief and loss by constantly speaking of the good times and advice that was given to these individuals to keep them alive, and a smile when I think or speak of them. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's how I remember my sister. Jenny says, thank you. This was very informative. Eileen says that one will need professional help when being affected biologically, psychologically, and socially more than normal. Right, more than normal. And more than normal is different for different people. It's not the same for everybody. And Ronnie says lots of information to help us. So it is about to be 8 o'clock. Thank you guys for being here today. I pray God's blessings upon all of you. that the Lord would strengthen you and guide you. If you are living with grief and loss, that this was instructive for you. There's a lot more information on this. This is just a tiny bit. But just keep in mind some of the things that we spoke about today. If you need help, reach out to someone that can help you. Don't stay in that negative place. You can be in a negative place for many years, and it's not going to be good for you in any way. So God bless you all. I hope to see you here next week, and we will have another topic which we will continue to discuss regarding mental health. I will have this up probably tomorrow or by the weekend on YouTube. So if you would like, join our YouTube page. We have over 300 sermons there and a lot of instructive information. So join our YouTube page. You can subscribe. And God bless you all. And I will see you again next week. Take care, guys. Have a good night.